Hi, Chris.
Yo,
All right, y'all. We're letting everybody in. Folks slowly joining. Just as a reminder, and I'll repeat this in a bit, we're recording this, and the recording, the slides will be posted on the employee resource page. This is not a webinar. This is a meeting, so make sure you are muted. Yeah, we just get people popping in all the time. Every time I think it slows down. All right, 2:01. I think we've kind of started to slow down. So we will get started. So Rachel, just make sure you can still see my slide.
You're good.
Thank you. Okay, so my name is Blair Blanchett. I am the VCAP coordinator with the association. I'll be giving the presentation today on updates to the VCAP manual for program years 25 and 26. I also have Rachel, who is our assistant coordinator. She's going to be helping with the chat, answering questions, that kind of thing. So without further ado, I'm going to get started, and I'm actually going to turn off my camera just to try to keep my computer working and everything. We will get rolling. Okay. So first things first, the components that we're going to discuss today, our agenda, if you will. We're going to be looking at the application submission schedule for program year 25. We have new variable lifespan cost share rates available for this program year, some minor updates to forms. The majority of our time, we're going to be discussing specification updates, and we'll finish with the few specifications that have not changed, things that have not changed, but I just want to point out to y'all. And then we have a brief window of time where we're going to have some unique funding available. So without further ado, starting with that application submission schedule and lifespans. So originally the applications were due the Friday before steering committee meetings. We are increasing that time. So there is a 2-week span between submission and the steering committee meeting. So for instance, for July, the steering committee meeting is on Friday, July 26th. They're always on the last Friday of the month, with exceptions for holidays. The applications are due by 5 p.m. 2 weeks prior on Friday, July 12th. So this is a longer amount of time. The reason we've done this is to give some more time for back and forth with the districts, kind of working out maybe kinks with the applications before we bring them to the steering committee, hopefully reducing the conditions for conditional approval, that kind of thing. Just trying to improve our processes. Because of that change in the submission deadline, we have also moved up the optional water cooler chat. Those water cooler chats are open time for questions. Districts can, oh, forgive me one moment. Thank you, guys. The water cooler chats will be the Tuesday before applications are due at 2 p.m. This is time for districts to ask questions of each other, ask questions of us, discuss difficult site visits, that kind of thing, ask application questions. And occasionally we have particular content that we cover, but optional. So I want to make this very clear. This will be a big change. Everyone can look at that calendar. It's on our website. Another pretty significant change I'm really excited about. So for a handful of practices, so our 5 maybe less engineered practices, conservation landscaping, rain gardens, 4. conservation landscaping, rain garden, dry well, and rainwater harvesting, we are offering the option for a shorter lifespan. So 5 years instead of 10, there would be a commensurately reduced reimbursement rate for those practices. So trying to incentivize longer contracts, but providing the option, recognizing that that is going to make this program a little more accessible. The max per application for each of these practice types is still the same. It's the rate of reimbursement that has been reduced. Everything that is more complex, so permeable pavement, vegetated stormwater conveyance, constructed wetland, bioretention, infiltration, green roof, and living shorelines, still have 10 years. There is a new lifespan box on part 2 of our contracts. I will point that out momentarily. So I recognize those are pretty significant changes to kind of put forward. If there are any questions about that, I'll take some questions before we transition to the next topic, or we can wait until the end. I'll give a few moments. Rachel can also point them out to me.
No questions in the chat.
Okay, great, thanks. So our next topic is form updates. So many of y'all might have recognized that we transitioned away from our original forms to something more similar to VACs. Just kind of tightened things up, made things a little more clean, aligned with VACs, which is more friendly to districts. So because of that transition, our form components are now part 1, part 2, and part 3. Part 1 is the applicant contract. Part 2 is the job sheet, essentially, is what we used to have, outlining the nature of that installation. It is signed by both the applicant and the board. And then part 3 is the final contract piece. So in order to submit an application to the steering committee, following signatures must be present. For part 1, it's an applicant signature. That's the only signature on that form. Part 2 is the technical need or district employee signature. This is saying there is a resource concern that needs to be addressed, and this is the appropriate practice. Part 2 also has a director signature and applicant signature block, but it is optional for submission to the steering committee. We recognize that with the extended time frame between application submission and steering committee review, the time frame becomes longer to turn over contracts. And it is upon the district to assure that the contract has all of the appropriate signatures, and the applicant is not contacted until those signatures have been acquired. So the steering committee is for review, but it is upon the district to assure the contract is complete. So the rest of this slide goes on to say, we're navigating the challenges of these long timeframes between boards and steering committees. And it is recommended to acquire the applicant's signature after district board and steering committee approval to allow the applicant to acknowledge conditions provided by either the board or committee. And then only after receiving all of those signatures can the applicant be informed of approval, conditional approval, and work can begin. This is for an application. So to clarify, for part 3, that's completing the contract, there is a final block that has the participant signature and the director signature. It says Soil and Water Conservation District. That is meant to be for a director. However, in the event that a director is not available to sign, the board can delegate authority to an associate director or staff member to sign part 3. It should only be done when necessary. It is not standard practice, and it has to be noted in the board minutes that the authority has been delegated and identifies the specific contracts to which it applies. This is the same language that came from VACs, identical. For payment requests to the steering committee, kind of similar to what I mentioned for applications. So for parts 1 and part 2, we need all of the signatures at that point. Part 3, we need the technician signature to certify it has been installed. The director's signature and applicant signature are optional. It's up to your board. If you guys prefer to have a director sign it first before it goes to the steering committee, fine. you can designate that system yourselves, but you don't need it to send it to the steering committee. That being said, you should not inform the applicant of approval of payment until you have the appropriate signatures. The final motion is the applicant signs part 3, it concludes the contract, and they can receive their cost sharing. This language about failure to complete a contract and retain all signatures was in the last manual, but I want to highlight it now, and I identified where it is in the new manual. For any practice marked complete and issued payment on or after July 1st, 2022, failure to obtain the appropriate signatures on a VCAP contract in its entirety will result in the amount provided in cost share funding for the practice, including TA, may be reimbursed to the association. So again, this is same as VAX, it's just saying you need to have all the signatures on your contracts before moving through the process as appropriate. Practice timelines. So all contracts have until the May steering committee meeting of the calendar year following steering committee approval to complete installation and submit their payment request. We originally had said June 1st. It's kind of became confusing. And this time frame is largely so we can make sure we're completing our grant reporting as appropriate. So we've clarified that in the manual. It now says May steering committee meeting to submit the payment request. So really mid-May, we need that payment request for any contract that is meant to be closed. What's challenging is, in this instance, we're talking about calendar years, not program years. So I provided 2 examples to kind of detail this. If a practice is approved for funding by the steering committee in December of this year, 2024, it must be submitted to the steering committee for payment by mid-May 2025. So it's 5 months to install. That's not challenging for many practices, but some of them might take longer. If a practice is approved for funding in January 2024, it must be submitted by May 2025. You have 17 months. So I just want to forewarn you, keep this in mind, and make sure we're informing the applicants of this time frame. So this is the appropriate sections on the contract I want to point out. So this is on part 2 under the statement of technical need. The required completion date is here. So it says practice must be installed and certified by the issuing date. So whatever you all determine as a necessary date in order to turn it around to the steering committee for that May meeting. We've also added in part 2 this lifespan block that I mentioned. So this is where you would designate for the appropriate practice, whether it's 5 or 10 years, and that'll help you determine the cost share. This line or this section was in our form for the last program year, but again, I just want to point it out to you. We also have a photo release on part 3. This is an opt-out, so that you need to initial to say, I don't want to have any photos of my practice used. If you have any questions about the form updates, feel free to put them into the chat, and Rachel can kind of help me moderate those. But I'm gonna keep going into general manual updates. This is a short section, so we can kind of revisit form updates or form questions if needed. So an overview of what happened before we had updated the VCAP manual. So the Department of Environmental Quality conducted a year-long stakeholder advisory group that reviewed the BMP clearinghouse, the practices that VCAP is based off of, that hadn't been updated really since 2013-ish, some parts since 2011. And so this was long overdue. And I'm very grateful to say that one of our steering committee members, Richard, and I were able to participate in this process and kind of watch how this unfolded and provide commentary. So we have updated practices to be in alignment with that new handbook. We also received feedback via a Google form from our district staff and partners. Our technical advisory committee met 3 times to discuss specific specifications. And then the steering committee consolidated all of that information into the manual that we're presenting now. So I see 2 questions in the chat. Let me pull these up. Got a question from Chris. Chris says, I know we had previously had a 3 months to get started note in the program with more solidified dates. Should we just use those as the hard deadline? So yes, there is a requirement to begin work within 90 days of approval by the steering committee. Steering committee right now, district staff, we don't have the capacity to verify that. We rely on y'all as district staff to verify that. That 90-day start is there for a host of reasons. We want to make sure people are proceeding with their practice so that we don't end up with cancellations at the last minute. We don't want to have big price changes from contractors because of a delay. So please hold people to that 90-day start. And maybe that's for a meadow, an initial spray down of the meadow, something like that to demonstrate the practice is moving forward. And we got a question about photo release. Does the photo release mean to put into publications, not for submission with the payment request? I see what you're saying. So for the payment request, that would be to demonstrate that the practice has been installed. We need those to prove the practice was installed. The photo release is if we use them publicly. So if we put them in a brochure or in a presentation, something like that. So the photo release would not exempt them from allowing us to provide photos for payment request. I hope that was clear. Okay. Thank you, Rachel. General manual updates. I don't want to say most, but we did reorganize components of the specifications and the opening sections of the manual just to make it a little bit clearer. There's been some new information added, and it just made sense in some cases to reorganize things. We also were looking at this from the perspective of having new staff come on board. I know a lot of districts are hiring, so we wanted to make something that was available to new staff to pick up, read, and get a good idea of how VCAP operates right off the bat. Of course, it's nice to have other staff to support that new staff member, but that just isn't always the case in a district, that there's someone already familiar with the program. Minor change I want to point out in specifications, the phrase plans and specifications has been updated to design plan components. Just want to point that out. Again, references from the clearinghouse have been transitioned to the new handbook. The handbook is available online via a platform called Encode. I've linked it here. So if after this webinar, you're really interested to look at it, it's available online for you to take a glance at. It's actually pretty nice. And then finally, calculations have been moved to the appendices. Just for clarity, it was kind of challenging to look at within the specifications themselves. So the opening section of the manual, part 1, kind of an overview of the program, how it works, nuts and bolts of application, payment processing, cost share rates, that kind of stuff. Again, reorganized for clarity. We have expanded the steering committee total membership by 1 up to just one more person, one more district. So if your district is interested in participating, please reach out to us. The steering committee meets on Fridays, and the meetings can be 3 hours long or so, and we ask them for their input on other components of the program. So we'd love to have another district join, discuss with your district manager if that is appropriate for your district. There's a complete overhaul of section 1.4 application and payment process to align with the new forms. This also includes the startup payment program and assignment of payment forms as well. So everything that I mentioned about signatures and whatnot is already in the manual. Part 1 also includes guidance on volunteer hours. So people that are doing their project themselves, DIYers, are eligible for up to 16 hours of volunteer labor at the federal volunteer rate, but it needs to be documented. With the application, we'd like to see that they are requesting that in advance, and then we have a form on our website that allows them to track what they have done. This becomes confusing when there's a professional doing part of the work and the landowner is doing part of the work. So we would need that to be laid out very clearly in the payment request, a distinct line between the hired professional and the homeowner, so that we are making it clear there's no double dipping there. So this italicized section is direct quote from the manual. Parts 2 and 3 are more about practices, reporting, things like that. So for section 2.3 stormwater BMPs and site conditions, there's actually a table that runs over the practices that VCAP offers and the resource concerns that we are trying to address. And it is guidance for, again, mostly new district staff on maybe what you should be thinking about based on what you see on the ground. We have updated to include meadows and mulch beds for treating erosion and excess runoff. There are 3 categories of use for our BMP. So it might be an inappropriate BMP for the resource concern, maybe not ideal, but can work in some circumstances and is an ideal BMP for that resource concern. So meadows and mulch beds are now listed as, depending on site conditions, they can be used to treat erosion and excess runoff. This is what we were seeing on the ground, so we just wanted to align the manual with that. We also added some sections on contributing, I spoke area wrong, contributing drainage area, slopes, and on-site soil investigations. Again, new staff, they come into the program, they get a site visit request, and they're asking, what do I do next? This section is meant to walk them through their thought process, that desktop review before meeting with a landowner. So reiterating, parts 1 through 3, the changes, the reorganizations are to clarify things, new staff. I recommend everybody read them, even if you aren't new. It was really helpful for us, for the steering committee members, for the TAC, everybody, kind of break down these pieces. So use this as an opportunity to revisit something you think you might already be familiar with. So general updates to the specifications. We've added under design plan components this line to clarify design changes. So to read it out to you, the district must be notified of any proposed changes to the approved design. Changes to the approved design may jeopardize cost share reimbursement. Steering committee has the discretion to approve or deny cost share reimbursement in the event of design changes. So this is within the specifications themselves. We wanted to provide this as a reminder when you're working with landowners and if you happen to intersect with contractors, that we want to be updated on potential changes to the design as the practice is installed. So if you have questions now about those opening sections, you can put them in the chat. Rachel can help me navigate those questions. But I'm going to continue to specifications next. This is going to be the bulk of the discussion today. Parts of it are dense. I don't want anyone to feel overwhelmed. So I'm going to give you the information. This is for you to revisit when the time comes that you think particular practice is appropriate for a site. I again encourage you to go to the new manual, pull out those in those specific pages, look at them just to refresh your memory. So impermeable surface removal to start. So when ISR is followed by any practice other than permeable pavement, permeable pavers, submit it as 2 applications for ISR and whatever the other practice might be. So let's say conservation landscaping, that's pretty common. We want one for ISR, we want one for conservation landscaping. It makes it easier to track the cost share amounts that are tied to each practice. And it's helpful in the event that one of the practices fails, particularly the secondary practice. So in the instance of someone using ISR, replacing their driveway, for instance, with conservation landscaping, if they then replace the conservation landscaping with turf, the ISR did not fail. The conservation landscaping failed. So it kind of helps us parse out contract responsibility and again, cost share. Originally, we had required soil testing as a part of the application, which is challenging. If you are replacing a parking lot, how do you get a soil test? So we're not requiring it with the application. We are asking for it as a part of the removal process prior to vegetation establishment in order to guide that establishment. My favorite part are planted practices. So we use species that are native according to the flora of Virginia. There's a digital flora. Again, I've linked it here if you want to look later. We are opening the door to allow uncertain species from the flora. We were seeing a lot of requests for species that were listed as uncertain. A lot of other resources were saying that they were native and they're commercially available. So again, trying to address the limitation of plant accessibility, especially in different parts of the state. We just don't have big nurseries with native plants all across the state of Virginia. So still native, allowing uncertain and introduced species are not acceptable. So this is a cutout from, or a screenshot from the Flora of Virginia. They all come with this map. I want to point out that this is the nativity status that you should be looking at. Red dots for native, gray dots for uncertain, introduced is blue. So a dot does not mean it is native. This is a good example because Pensimon digitalis is very popular. So we got a question about ISR. If ISR is going to turf, would that be a separate practice? So no, ISR going to turf is just ISR. So you can replace impermeable surfaces with turf. That would be a standalone application. It's only if you were replacing it with another practice like conservation landscaping. I mean, if you wanted to convert your whole driveway into bioretention, we would need another application for that. And again, the exception being permeable pavers, you only apply for permeable pavers, even if you were replacing your driveway or another impermeable surface. Good clarification. All planted practices should include the scientific name, and you can also include the common name and the complete scientific name. So genus and species. If it is a cultivar, make sure we include both the genus, the species, and the cultivar name. So for instance, if you had Cornus florida, you could just list Cornus florida. You could say Cornus florida flowering dogwood. If you use Itea virginica, Little Henry, which is a cultivar, so anytime we see those quotations, that's identifying it as a cultivar. You would need to list at least Itea virginica, quotations, Little Henry. You can include Virginia sweetspire, the common name as well. So on the right-hand side here is an example. This is actually a screenshot from the NC State Extension Toolbox. I like it because it has good information about plants. It includes the scientific name, includes the common names. Then it also includes a little subsection of cultivars. So it identifies Little Henry as a cultivar that is a dwarf arching. Now, the reason we want to do this is we need to make sure they are native, and the genus is not enough to identify that things are native. And the genus and the cultivar name is also not enough to identify things as native. This is not upon you as the district staff. We should be requesting this of the landowners to request of designers and installers. I want to reiterate this extension gardener toolbox is a bonus resource. If you like it, it still must be native according to the Flora of Virginia. Tree planting, CL2, the density has been reduced from 460 trees per acre to 300 trees per acre. This was at the recommendation of partner organizations, DOF, NRCS. We were kind of seeing that this density was a little higher. So 300 trees per acre. And the plant material can now include, if you would like, tree or containers no larger than 2-inch calipers and includes trees or shrubs. Originally, it was exclusive to bare root seedlings. And now we're allowing for maybe some larger plants if the area makes sense to do that. If you're planting acres and acres, I maybe wouldn't recommend that, but the option is there as allowed, as necessary. CL3, we have changed the name from mulch beds to mixed planting beds. So this will be a fun change for all of us. This is to emphasize the plant coverage as opposed to mulch. Mulch can still be a part of this installation, but we want to emphasize plant density, that concept of green mulch, and soil coverage by a plant more than anything else. So again, this italicized section is from the manual. Mixed beds aims for a mature plant canopy with 90% soil coverage. This is really at maturity. To achieve this, planting at a 75% density with the suggested spacing is recommended. So the suggested spacing block is in planted practices except for riparian buffers and tree plantings. Those have different densities, but anything else has this suggested spacing. So providing this early to your applicants to provide to designers is key. Filter strip, CL4. I realize this is a wall of text. This is included in the manual. We included it to clarify when filter strips were appropriate, really what their goal was, what makes them different from other planted practices. So filter strips are receiving sheet flow, typically from impervious areas. Managed turf is acceptable. And we want to see that sheet flow, or I'm sorry, that impervious surface flow distributed evenly across the practice. This definition goes on to discuss if it is coming from a pipe or a channel, maybe you need a level spreader. It becomes engineered very quickly. What I want you to take away is just because a planted practice is receiving impervious flow doesn't make it a filter strip automatically. We kind of need to work out how the water enters that practice. And this might help. So this is actually from New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I think it was really useful in conveying this information. Water is moving across this parking lot and enters this stone trench. For our purposes, maybe that would be a level spreader. You don't necessarily need it here, depending on the slope, and the runoff is evenly distributed across the practice. So we got a question about the, oh, and Rachel's answering it, but for the group, CL2 have a spacing of 12 feet for trees. For mixed plantings, rain gardens, bioretention, the tree spacing can be wider. Yes, it's saying that for bioretention, rain gardens, conservation, landscaping, we're looking for ground cover more than anything else. And so we have a verticality element in those plantings that maybe is less critical, or we're thinking about less for tree plantings and riparian buffers. So you might, in a conservation landscaping, mixed bed, rain garden, bioretention, space out your trees more, but you're covering the ground with other things. Back to filter strip, CL4. It's always kind of challenging to think about the measurement for a filter strip. So the length of a filter strip is actually down the slope and the width is along a contour. Use this image to guide you, because I know some people, myself included, can talk ourselves into circles about length versus width, especially since it's different for different practices. What I want you to notice is the minimum length down the slope has changed. So it is shorter for shallower slopes and it is longer for steeper slopes. And there's a max slope requirement of 8%. You don't have to memorize this. If the time comes, revisit this in the manual. Last of our conservation landscaping, riparian buffer. Width has not changed, but again, density has been reduced to 300 trees per acre. Same as the tree planting. Chris, I know you've got more questions about spacing. We can revisit the spacing discussion at the end, or Rachel can help you in the chat. So rain garden had a pretty significant change. The impervious drainage area maximum has increased to 5,000 square feet. So that's a twofold increase, pretty big change. The maximum drainage area entering a rain garden is 1/2 acre. So you can kind of see that difference there, 21,000 square feet of total drainage area, maximum of 5,000 impervious. We clarified when engineered soil mix and under drains are required in this nice chart, also in the manual. So when your infiltration rate is greater than 1/2 inch per hour, compost amendment is fine. If it is less than 1/2 inch, you're going to need an engineered soil media, and under 1/4 inch under drain, maybe you need a bioretention. Maybe this isn't the right site for a rain garden, those kind of things. All of our infiltration style practices, rain gardens, bioretention, dry well, those things we have very clearly stipulated must be 10 feet from building foundation, greater if upgraded. Little difference for permeable pavers, we'll get there. Rainwater harvesting. The minimum treatment volume to receive cost share is 250 gallons. So you must be treating at least 422 square feet of roof area. We didn't want to poach away from rain barrel programs that districts have. This seemed like a good way to look at that. So again, it's treatment volume, even if you pair together different size containers to reach that treatment volume capture. Tank size should consider dead storage. So area below the outlet, let's say your hose if you're just using a straight hose, and freeboard above the overflow. So we are going to ask that tanks be 10% larger than treatment volume to account for that. There's also expanded information on underground and above ground tank requirements, how they should be installed. I didn't detail it here. We don't very frequently, if at all, see underground tanks, but want you to be aware that option is there. The next few practices are more engineered practices. So for bioretention and moving forward, I put this note in the top right. As an engineered practice, district staff should rely on a contractor to meet these requirements. Really, we're looking to the district staff to verify that these things are in existence with the application. Reach out to Rachel or myself or your fellow district staff members if you have questions. So this is going to be a lot of information, and let it percolate. Come to water cooler chats, we can discuss more. Starting off simple, must be 10 feet from building foundation, greater if upgrading. Steep slopes may use a low profile block retaining wall with a low permeability geotextile and foot drain behind the wall if necessary. Again, we'd want to see your reasoning here, the contractor's reasoning, to explain why this was the most effective option. The bioretention specification is for level 1 or baseline designs. If there is a site that has an infiltration rate less than ½ inch per hour, that installation needs to be a level 2 design. This is just more engineered. There's stricter requirements. We can help you through that process, but it's contingent upon the infiltration rate. The level 2 design is not included in the manual. We have included more details about the nature of an engineered soil media. So Richard very kindly outlined the percentage of sand, soil fines, and leaf compost, or if you're going to make it yourself, you can make this mix 4:1:3 by volume. Again, we don't want to, there's a DIYer who's installing a bioretention. They can mix it themselves if they'd like. Ponding depth for bioretention has been clarified. 3 to 12 inches, 6 inches is typical. Bioretention, sometimes depending on the nature of the contributing drainage area, infiltration rate, etc., might have gravel in the bottom. 3 inches of choker stone over clean washed gravel. Trying to be very clear about clean wash. These engineered practices will have retreatment and an outlet conveyance. They should be appropriate to the site, appropriate for the contributing drainage area, nature of the practice. Again, you're really looking to make sure that the contractor thought this through. Outlets must be size greater than the treatment volume and or equal to a 100-year storm event up to the contractor, and emergency overflow controls should be associated with the 2- and 10-year design storms. And we have more information about the underdrain, 4-inch in diameter, composed of particular materials. So this last bullet underlined point reiterates what I said, which is you can provide this to the contractor to make sure that they understand the nature of the program. Infiltration practices. Want to clarify, they do not convey water like a French drain. So water might be conveyed into the infiltration practice, but it is meant to contain water and infiltrate it at a particular location rather than just moving it from A to B. Still 10 feet from building foundation, greater if up gradient. Very popular are these bottomless or perforated containers, proprietary style devices. They should be designed to support appropriate structural loads depending on where they are. Non-woven geotextile should only be used on the sides, not on the bottom, and never woven geotextile to prevent clogging. Baseline designs require an infiltration rate greater than ½ inch per hour. If you're seeing less than ½ inch an hour, it probably isn't right for an infiltration practice. And then pre-treatment is required depending on where the water is coming from to enter the practice. So it might be gravel diaphragm, a leaf screen is coming from a downspout, or bay, something like that. Again, we want these things to last, so we want to make sure the water entering the practice is as free of sediment as possible. Permeable pavement. Pool patios are ineligible for cost share. And stop. Contributing drainage area to the permeable paver, that ratio of CDA to practice area is recommended to be 2 to 1. So twice the drainage area to the area of the practice. Rachel has very kindly put a note about this in our practice calculators. So I'll point that out in a bit, but just want you to be aware. Again, 10 feet from a building or use an impermeable liner. A lot of times it depends on the nature of the building that the permeable pavement is up against. Is there a basement? Is there something else nearby we need to be concerned about? But that option is there to protect the foundation, to use an impermeable liner between the practice and that foundation. Excavation depth will be above the 1-to-1 soil bearing zone slope of the foundation. So we're protecting that foundation again while excavation is occurring and the practice is installed. Permeable pavers are not ideal for slopes over 5%. There is a way to terrace permeable paver reservoirs to accommodate for this. Again, above 5%, we should be cautious. This is what a terraced reservoir installation looks like. This is actually from DC Department of Energy and Environment handbook. So this is the surface of the paver. It looks flat like a driveway or walkway. Internal are these step down reservoirs. So the water can infiltrate within each chamber and it's not just flowing to the bottom and coming out. And the reservoir should not exceed 2 feet of depth per chamber. And deference is given to manufacturer specifications. So we've obviously provided guidance in the manual, but if the installer or designer has particular questions, it's not very clear in the manual or in the handbook, manufacturer specs will usually have some feedback, some information. This next section is more information on the components of permeable pavement. We've been seeing more and more contractors kind of taking this on. I want to provide some more guidance on what we are looking for. This is about the particular layers within a permeable pavement installation. So in this diagram, you can see at the top, surface pavers, bedding layer, reservoir, and then something at the bottom to prevent infiltration from the bottom. So maybe it's sand or a liner or something like that. You can also see on the right, this curb edge restraint helps keep the pavers in place, and it can be a useful tool for diverting flow with heavy sediment loading. And so I've detailed these different layers here. Again, it's in the manual, and this is a helpful tool to provide to contractors. It goes over the preferred or typical depth of the different stone sizes. Things I want to point out, gravel 57 stone needs to be clean washed, and the separation layer at the bottom can be sand, it can be particular stone sizes, or non-woven geotextile, not woven. And then the reservoir should be as flat as possible on the bottom, and under drains are required for infiltration rates under 1/2 inch. I mentioned edge restraints. They can be raised to divert contributing drainage area with high pollution loading. So we really want to have impervious surfaces going into permeable pavers, prevent that clogging. There might be some pervious. If there's pervious drainage into permeable pavers, having a pretreatment like a gravel diaphragm is helpful for diverting it. And footings on the downhill side, that edging, or I'm sorry, if there's edging used, on the downhill side, you might need footings to keep the pavers from shifting. This is helpful for the contractor and something for you to look for if you are going out to do checks during installation. We always like process footings. Living shorelines. We're reaching the end of our specifications, folks. Big change. We've increased the fetch limit from 1.5 miles to 2 miles in any direction. So this does mean that for those of you that install living shorelines, you need to be cognizant of the appropriate permit for this project. Many of you already use a JPA, but just want to clarify that for projects with a fetch over 1.5 miles, a JPA is required. We used to have an exception for minimum shore angle, So meaning if the longest fetch is a very small percentage of impact on that practice, there was the opportunity for discussion with the steering committee. It was very difficult to parse out what was appropriate. So we've removed that exception. It is 2 miles in any direction. And that is the only that is the primary stipulation for living shorelines. The practice should only be installed in areas with eroding shorelines as determined by a site evaluation formed by Cs, VIMs. We've added the opportunity for qualified district staff to make this determination. Qualified district staff is defined as someone with expertise in living shorelines as documented by a letter outlining their experience, approved by their district board and the steering committee. So this is an option. We've been seeing an increase in interest in living shorelines. The workload is very high. We're trying to keep applications moving. This is not a requirement for districts to take this on. The option is there if you and your board and your district manager would like to use it. But still, Cs and VIMs, excellent resources always. We require design review for every living shoreline in addition to that site assessment. The design review can be conducted by VIMs or Cs, and note that Cs, if they are the one conducting the design review, they would also like to be the one doing the site visit to assess for that erosion. All living shoreline applications should include a site and design review cover sheet. This is just showing that Cs or VIMs has assessed the design and said it is appropriate, conditionally approved, or inappropriate. The site assessment component of it, again, can be Cs, VIMs, or a qualified district employee saying erosion is present. I've linked to that sheet. It's on the employee resource page. Very kindly, Cs developed a design review checklist that is available as well. Under outside resources. So this is a pretty hefty document that includes the components that Cs is looking for when they are conducting a design review. So if we have contractors that are struggling to determine all of the things that they need in that design, maybe this is going to help them get there a little more quickly. Using this design review checklist does not guarantee approval by the steering committee. We still need a design review by Cs, VIMs, or Cs or VIMs, but this is just a helpful resource. The appendices have been expanded to include more sizing examples, and Rachel, incredible, developed these calculators to help you size practices appropriately that are all underneath our forms on the website. And as I mentioned earlier, she's included these kind of notes or considerations, warnings, depending on the nature of the practice. So I ran this permeable paver calculator to try to make those warnings come up. So please do not overlook these if you use the calculators. Things that have not been updated. And so this next section will go pretty quickly, but if you have questions about the specifications, now is the time to put them into the chat. So there are 3 specifications that have not been updated yet: green roof, vegetated stormwater conveyance, and constructed wetlands. There are least popular practices. They're going to require a bigger time commitment to review, and the clearinghouse is still effective through the next year. So those are going to be the same. And things that have not changed, but I want to highlight. Planting density is critical to installations. It makes them more successful. It prevents the establishment of invasive species. It makes them more effective filters. So I want to encourage you to encourage your applicants, and if you run across contractors and designers, to use that plant spacing guidance. Infiltration style practices cannot be installed on wetland soils within the FEMA 100-year floodplain, or where the bottom of the practice will be less than 24 inches from the seasonal high water table. So this has been in the manual for many, many years, but we want to bring it to your attention. So with the seasonal high water table in particular, we are asking that you use web soil survey to identify the potential for that intersection. So there's a section in web soil survey that says depth to water table. If that looks like it is going to be within 24 inches of the bottom of the practice, if they're rain garden, fire retention, dry well, infiltration, or permeable paver, it is upon the applicant to prove that that intersection is not going to occur. So you are not automatically denied from participating in VCAP if web soil survey is demonstrating that, but the applicant must hire a professional soil scientist to verify the depth of the seasonal high water table and show that there is that spacing between seasonal high water table and practice reservoir bottom. DCR has a really nice flood risk information system website to identify the 100-year floodplain. If you haven't looked at it yet, it's a really great resource. And I've linked to that here if you want to check it out afterwards. So this is not new information, but want to reiterate the importance of these characteristics, in particular the seasonal high water table and floodplain, to the success of the practice long term. Okay, last section is a unique funding opportunity. So the association has funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation just through May of next year, 2025. So very short time frame to do some neat things. We're trying to test some concepts out, see what information we can gather, and continue to make improvements of the program. So first of all, I've linked to a document on the website that kind of outlines all of these protocols for your review later. So we are looking to support particular installations for particular applicants. So first of all, we are offering up to 100% of eligible costs covered, up to $50,000 per applicant for these groups. Community-facing or publicly accessible projects with the hope of using them as a outreach opportunity. So we would like to see a VCAP sign there. We are targeting individuals within census block groups that are the 70th percentile or above for low income populations, as demonstrated by EJ Screen. So our last DCR grant had a request to continue to work in low income geographic areas. We're trying to support that work with this unique funding. And then for individuals outside of that 70th percentile low income block group, if they can demonstrate that their household income is less than twice the federal poverty level, they also qualify for this 100% of eligible costs covered. And that household income, there's a chart that is included in the document I've linked here. To request this additional funding with the application, on part 2, there's a block that says additional funding. Are you using any additional funding? You would list it there. And then submit a Form 7 cost share adjustment form that parses out the 2 different sources, our typical and typical cost share rate, and then whatever is over for NIFLA. Completed projects that use this funding receive their traditional TA payment of $1,200 and then an additional $1,200 from NIFLA. And at the bottom of each of these slides, I've stipulated we would need to receive payment, these payment requests, for the May 2025 steering committee meeting at the very outside. And if it is late, you will not receive 100% of cost share. We have a very hard deadline for this funding source. And even that May steering committee meeting is going to be a really tight turnaround. So I want you to think about that when you are discussing this with potential applicants. And this is also only within the Bay watershed. Same opportunity is allowing us to test out paying design fees. So VCAP does require designs for installations. And we are trying to target individuals that are hesitant to submit an application due to that upfront cost. So there's $250 per potential application available to fund that design. And in order to request the $250, the district must have met with the applicant, done a site visit assessment using the form on the website, identified a resource concern and an appropriate practice to address that concern. And the funding must be directed to the contractor or designer using our direct payment form. So it goes straight from the district to the designer. This $250 is considered part of cost share and would be deducted from the final cost share payments. Lastly, the SNF funding has the opportunity to provide maintenance on VCAP practices that are currently within lifespan. This is to re-up these practices. It would renew their lifespan. They would have a new contract number. And the maintenance must not be due to neglect or failure to maintain the practice. This is for situations where maybe it needs a refresh, an update. For instance, we saw a practice, heard of a practice recently that the inlet was damaged and it needed to be refurbished. So something like that. The application materials must be submitted as an original application, so same materials in the checklist. You would include a maintenance cover sheet. This is just a one-page document outlining what maintenance has been done in the past to keep it up and why this needs maintenance funding now to refresh it. And approval is at the discretion of the steering committee. So final reminders before we get to questions. All of these materials, forms, manual, startup payment forms, assignment of payment, the living shoreline, this cover page, and checklist calculators are on the employee resources page. I highly recommend you go to the website. Rachel put it in the chat. Take a glance and see where everything is. Review the manual, familiarize yourself with it, especially as practices in particular come up. Pull out that spec. Water cooler chats are held the Tuesday before applications are due at 2 p.m. Great time for questions. We'd love to see you guys. Applications are now due 2 weeks before steering committee meeting. The calendar for all of these dates is on the website. It's at the bottom. You do have to scroll to the bottom. Last two things. If you would like a hard copy of this manual, you can fill out this form. Rachel's going to put this link in the chat. We're trying to determine how much interest there is in a hard copy before we determine if we're going to order them. And then if you have feedback on the manual, Rachel's going to put another form in the chat. This is if you spot an error that we can address, that'd be great. If you have general feedback, we will get to it when it is an appropriate time to update the manual or bring it to the TAC if that is necessary. So that is our manual update. If we have any questions at this time, I would be happy to take a couple of them before the hour. I'll give you guys an opportunity to process everything that you've seen. And if we don't have any questions, we will stay. But if you don't have any questions, thank you guys for your feedback in updating this manual and for continuing to make VCAP a growing program. Rachel and I have only seen the number of applications and requests for cost share go up and up and up, which is fantastic. So really grateful for your hard work. I know with this new program year starting, y'all are going to be really busy with VACs. So best of luck, enjoy your holiday, and we will see you at the next water cooler chat. Thanks, guys. Okay, I think, Rachel, we can stop recording.